Chapter 7. White Reign of Terror. It terrified and subdued Louisiana. It swept over Texas. Mounted and disguised ruffians rode through Mississippi in 1871, breaking up the colored schools and driving away preachers and teachers, wrote Eugene Lawrence in The Ku Klux Conspiracy, which appeared in an October 1872 issue of Harper's Weekly. Continued Lawrence, they covered western Tennessee. They murdered, whipped, and tormented in North Carolina. In Georgia, we are told, whole counties of colored voters are disenfranchised by the terrors. Not even the Congressional Committee has been able to pierce the depths of this widespread conspiracy. To safeguard black citizens' rights, back in May 1870, a month before the creation of the Justice Department, Congress passed the Enforcement Act. Known as a Force Act, it established stiff penalties for voter suppression by anyone, including state officials who tried to keep people from registering to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Force Act also made it a crime to keep black citizens from holding office and serving on juries. The president who signed that Force Act into law wasn't Andrew Johnson, but the hero of Appomattox, Ulysses S. Grant, Republican. Back on November 3, 1868, Grant had defeated the Democratic nominee, Horatio Seymour, 214 to 80 in the Electoral College, to win the presidency. And as historian Brooks D. Simpson has reminded us, this was the first presidential election where African Americans voted in large numbers in the wake of the establishment of new state governments under the Reconstruction Acts, as well as Tennessee's decision to allow blacks to vote. That Force Act, which Grant signed into law in May 1870, needed backup. By May 1871, Congress had passed two more Force Acts. One empowered the president to use military force against terrorists and put lawless places under martial law, which happened in 9 South Carolina counties in the fall of 1871. According to Grant biographer Gene Edward Smith, that year, under the watch of Justice Department Chief Amos Ackerman, more than 3,000 Klansmen were indicted. 600 Klansmen were convicted, writes Smith, and 65 ringleaders imprisoned for up to 5 years at the United States Penitentiary in Albany. When myself and my colleagues shall leave these halls of Congress and turn our footsteps toward our southern homes, we know not that the assassin may await our coming. Joseph Rainey, in an April 1871 speech in the U.S. House of Representatives, urging tougher action against the likes of the KKK. Along with physical violence and threats of violence, black officeholders and their people contended with psychological warfare. Black lawmakers were often ridiculed and lampooned in newspapers, presented as buffoons, brutes, and beasts. Despite the rounding up of white terrorists under the Force Acts, black voter suppression continued, along with violence against black people and white Republicans. On Easter Sunday, April 13, 1873, Colfax, Louisiana, in the heart of the Red River Valley, became a war zone. This was in the aftermath of the hotly contested elections of 1872, which resulted in rival governments in Louisiana, a radical Republican one, and a fusion ticket of Democrats and conservative Republicans. In early 1873, Louisiana was under Republican rule, and tensions remained high. Those tensions increased after the Bayou State's radical Republican governor, William Kellogg, removed Grant Parish as sheriff and judge, both Democrats, and replaced them with radical Republicans. So on that Easter day, members of the White League descended upon Colfax, the parish seat. Black men made the town's courthouse their fortress, but to no avail. They were outgunned. The White Leaguers not only fired into the building, they set it on fire. When black men, having laid down their arms, fled the flames under a flag of truce, many were shot dead. Others had their throats cut. A few were hanged. The total number killed in the fighting and executed afterwards was somewhere between 70 and 165, writes Richard White in The Republic for Which It Stands, the United States During Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1896. It was hard to get an accurate account, Men were killed beyond the town. Others ended up in anonymous graves. 3 white men died that day in Colfax. In the 1920s, a monument to them was erected in Colfax's whites-only cemetery with the following inscription: "In loving remembrance, erected to the memory of the heroes, Stephen Decatur Parrish, James West Hadnot, Sidney Harris, who fell in the Colfax riot fighting for white supremacy, April 13, 1873. It was for the cause of white supremacy that some Southern whites evicted tenants who voted Republican. Businesses were boycotted. Black schools were defunded. People were driven from office. Persecutions were relentless. Some white Republicans, Southern-born and Northern transplants alike, threw in the towel. A White Reign of Terror in Louisiana was the title of a letter to the editor of the New York Herald, published in the newspaper's September 3, 1874 issue, shortly after white rage erupted in Coushatta, the parish seat of Red River. Here, power-hungry Democrats, members of the White League, killed in cold blood 6 Republican officeholders, including the sheriff and the justice of the peace, along with several of their black supporters. The Vicksburg Riot was the title of a January 5, 1875 piece in Silver City, Idaho's Owyhee Daily Avalanche. On December 7, 1874, when several hundred black men of Warren County, Mississippi, marched on Vicksburg in protest of the illegal ouster of a black sheriff, Peter Crosby, and other black officials, white men started shooting. For another 10 days, some of the young white participants, joined by reinforcements from across the river in Louisiana, stayed on the warpath, wrote Stephen Hahn in A Nation Under Our Feet, Black Political Struggles in the Rural South from Slavery to the Great Migration. When the violence ended, at least 29 black people were dead, and a great many more had been wounded and terrorized. The reign of terror seemed unceasing. Race Feuds in Mississippi was the title the New York Evening Post gave a September 7, 1875 report on a massacre in Clinton, Mississippi. Following a rumor of an impending black attack on Clinton, several hundred members of the paramilitary group the White Liners from nearby towns just hunted the whole country clean out, a black eyewitness testified the following year. Just every black man they could see, they were shooting at him, just the same as birds. Days earlier, white men had shot up a Republican rally. The Clinton Massacre, in which some 30 to 50 black people were killed, occurred 6 months after a landmark civil rights bill cleared Congress. On March 1, 1875, President Grant signed into law a civil rights bill that outlawed discrimination in places of public accommodation, such as hotels, restaurants, and railroad cars. Offenders could be imprisoned for a year and fined $1,000. The radical Senator Charles Sumner had introduced this bill 5 years earlier. "Don't let the bill fail," said Sumner to Frederick Douglass and others gathered around his bed as he lay dying in 1874. U.S. Congressman John Roy Lynch of Mississippi was one of the bill's most eloquent, passionate black backers. A month before the bill passed, Lynch delivered a powerful speech in the House. "I appeal to all the members of the House, Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, to join with us in the passage of this bill, which has for its object the protection of human rights." Lynch asserted that when everyone's rights are protected, then can all truthfully say that this beautiful land of ours, over which the Star-Spangled Banner so triumphantly waves, is in truth and in fact the land of the free and the home of the brave. When the Civil Rights Act of 1875 passed, Charles Sumner was not the only radical Republican who had died. So had Thaddeus Stevens, for example. What's more, while Republicans formed the majority in the Senate, Democrats, following the 1874 midterm elections, held the majority in the House. Ill winds, long blowing, whipped up into cyclones as the power of Republicans diminished, as white Democrats remained hell-bent on regaining rule in the South, ever ready as always to use violence. Prince Rivers's majority black town of Hamburg in South Carolina's Aiken County, of which Rivers was one of 3 black founders in 1871, came under attack in the summer of 1876, following a black-white clash on the 4th of July. While making their way through Hamburg in a wagon, 2 young white men, Tommy Butler and Henry Getson, were inconvenienced by a parade of black soldiers, members of a National Guard regiment, celebrating their nation's 100th birthday. A vexed Getson decided to ram the marchers rather than go around them. The wagon stopped just short of harming anyone. "Mr. Getson, I don't know for what reason you treat me in this manner," said Doc Adams, the regiment's captain. "What?" said Getson. "Aiming to drive through my company." "Well, this is the route I always travel." To keep the peace, Doc Adams had his men part with the command, "Open order!" That was not good enough. The next day, attorney Matthew Butler, no relation to Tommy Butler, filed a lawsuit claiming that Adams's men had blocked a public road. Butler wanted the black militia disbanded. This suit came before trial judge Prince Rivers. After things got heated during the hearing on July 6th, Rivers called for a cooling-off period. When the hearing resumed on July 8th, the plaintiffs came to Hamburg with more than their grievance. They were accompanied by armed white men, members of local rifle clubs. Attorney Butler demanded that the militia surrender its weapons. For the cause of peace, Prince Rivers concurred. But the black militia, some 80 to 100 men, were having none of that and hastened to a warehouse. Soon, more than 200 white men surrounded that warehouse. Before long, shots rang out. A battle ensued. White reinforcements joined, including some from nearby Augusta, bearing a cannon. At least 1 white man and 6 black men died. There is no record of how many people were wounded during the shooting and subsequent attacks on black homes, including that of Prince Rivers. The effects of the massacre spread and galvanized the South Carolina Democratic Party, says historian Richard Zuchek, while at the same time it drove a wedge between Republicans at the state and federal levels. White Democrats had been divided over the upcoming 1876 gubernatorial campaign, with some arguing for an alliance with Republican Governor Daniel Chamberlain as the safest means of achieving victory. As Zuchik goes on to say, the Hamburg massacre and its aftermath silenced such talk and catapulted to prominence the straight-out strategy, which supported former Confederate General Wade Hampton for governor. What's more, Governor Chamberlain's plea for peacekeeping federal troops in the Palmetto State was ignored. In that same year, Tunis Campbell, who had been such a force for good in McIntosh County, Georgia, and who had been arrested several times on trumped-up charges, was convicted of engaging in corruption while a legislator. The 63-year-old man was sentenced to a year of hard labor. On or about the 12th of January, 1876, the guard from the state prison came about 7 o'clock a.m. and handcuffed me, and with a chain about 12 feet long, dragged me along the streets of Savannah to the Central Railroad, and then took me 140 miles from Savannah to a prison camp on the plantation of Colonel Jack Smith's in Washington County, state of Georgia. Campbell writes in his 1877 memoir, Sufferings of the Reverend T.G. Campbell and His Family, in Georgia. It is impossible to describe the way in which prisoners were worked, Campbell continued. They were taken out as soon as they could see, both in winter and summer, and kept to work as long as it was light, with 1 hour for dinner. Prisoners who couldn't keep up with the workload, chopping wood, for example, were beaten most unmercifully with a leather strop or a buggy trace. These beatings ranged from 50 to 100 lashes. The year 1876 also marked one of the most controversial presidential elections in U.S. history, and its outcome would signal the end of Reconstruction. Economic hard times. In 1873, the world was hit with the first global Great Depression. Called a panic back then, it would not end in America until the late 1870s. During the Depression, several million people lost jobs as factories and other businesses shuttered, as banks went bust. Many people who held on to jobs only did so by agreeing to wage cuts. The only work some could find was part-time. As the saying goes, when white people get a cold, black people get pneumonia. A major blow to the black community came in late June 1874, when the Freedmen's Bank collapsed. By then, it had more than 30 branches in 17 states and the District of Columbia. More than 60,000 customers had trusted the bank with more than $3 million of their hard-earned money. White managers stopped making safe investments with depositors' money and had begun making risky ones, particularly investments in railroad stocks. Losses on those investments plunged the bank into deep debt. Not long before the bottom fell out, Frederick Douglass was invited to be its president. In his effort to save the bank, Douglass had even invested $10,000 of his personal funds. Nevertheless, the bank failed.